How to choose the right shutter speed for any situation. This week, we're going to be focusing on another critical aspect of photography, and that, my friends, is shutter speed. Understanding how to choose the right shutter speed for different situations will really help you capture the desired effect and also improve the overall quality of your images. Plus, as an added bonus, it will enable you to get a bit more creative because you'll be able to decide on what the outcome is meant to be. And you've probably seen some images that are fantastic images with things like light trails and smooth silky water. You might not know how to achieve that. So today we're going to learn exactly how to do that. Now, before we do dive in a little bit deeper, if you head to my website, which is on3legs.com, that is with the number 3, just think of the tripod, on3legs.com, you can download a free copy of my camera setup checklist. All right, so what is shutter speed? Well, shutter speed refers to the length of time the camera shutter is open. So if you can imagine, it opens and shuts every time you hit the button on the top of your camera, the shutter button, and it will determine how much light gets through to hit your sensor. Now, it's typically measured in fractions of a second, like 1/250th of a second, or maybe 1/60th of a second for anything faster than 1 second. And if it is a second or slower than 1 second, typically you'll see it in full seconds, like 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, etc. So, how does it affect your photos overall? Well, first of all, let's talk about motion blur, because a fast shutter speed, like say 1/1000th of a second, is going to freeze everything in your shot. It's going to freeze motion. And this is ideal for capturing sharp images of things like, fast moving subjects such as sports, wildlife, or any action type shots. A slower shutter speed, let's say like 1/30th of a second, can create motion blur, and that's going to give a sense of movement. So if you want to introduce nice movement into your images, like, creative effects like light trails, blurred aircraft propellers, or, helicopter blades, which never look good when they're frozen. It's always better to blur them a bit. Or maybe silky smooth water, like you've seen in a lot of landscape photographers' images, then that's how we do that, with lower shutter speeds. The other thing you need to consider is exposure, because you can use the shutter speed to affect the overall exposure of your images. A fast shutter speed is going to allow less light to hit the sensor, which can result in dark images if no other settings are changed. So if you don't change anything but your shutter speed and you make it a faster shutter speed, it is going to let less light in to hit the sensor. You're going to end up with a darker image. Now, this is really useful in bright conditions or when you want to avoid overexposure in your image. And of course, a slow shutter speed, on the other hand, is going to let in more light. And what this does is going to make your image brighter. Same thing, as long as no other settings were changed. Now, this is also helpful in low light situations. Now, with slow shutter speeds, though, you do need to be very cautious of camera shake, which can blur your images unintentionally. So when you're using slower shutter speeds, it's probably a really good idea to stabilize your camera with maybe a tripod or by leaning on something to brace yourself to avoid that camera shake and ensure a sharp image. Quite often I will lean on a building or a tree, or even if you just put your elbows in as you hold your camera, make sure you tuck your elbows right into your body. You'll find that that'll help stabilize the camera and that'll help you ensure a sharp image. Even though you may be even shooting on a tripod or something stable, things like foliage in trees and surrounds will still blur. So, if you're doing like a seascape and there's a boat going through, a bird flying through, that's probably going to still blur if you have a slower shutter speed. So you may have to still increase your shutter speed to counteract that, even though you might be stable on a tripod. Now, here's some practical tips for using shutter speed. Also going to put some examples up on the screen as I go through these, so you get a bit of a feel for what you can do creatively, because I think this is a real fun thing to use to get more creative with your shots, is adjusting your shutter speed. So if you want to freeze everything in your images, this is essentially the basics. You need a faster shutter speed. And then if you want to create anything that is intentionally blurred, you need a slower shutter speed. So, as I said before, action shots like sports or wildlife, try using a shutter speed like maybe 1/1000th of a second or higher. And what this will do is help you capture really sharp images that just freeze everything in the image. The only exception with this, like if you're doing sports, you might be, let's say you're capturing, a runner running down a track or a race car going around a track. You might want to also capture the sense of their movement by blurring the background as you pan your shot. Now, you might have seen those where you pan the shot and the background blurs and the subject's nice and sharp, or maybe even just blurring car wheels, or like I said before, aircraft propellers or helicopter blades. With this type of photography, it can be a little bit tricky, so you're going to need to experiment a little bit to see what shutter speeds that you need. But let me tell you, it's worth the effort if you master it, or when you master it, I should say, because you will master it. You've just got to practice it and you'll see that it will work really well. Now, if you are shooting extremely fast shutter speeds, you may need to increase your ISO or use a wider aperture, because remember that fast shutter speed is going to let less light in, and so you're going to have to compensate for that with either your ISO or your aperture. Now, with your aperture, you'll use a wider aperture, which is a smaller f number, and that'll help you shoot at high speeds, such as something like 1/1000th of a second, because those, as I said, those shutter speeds will let the less light in through your sensor. Now, if you're not sure about what aperture is, you can check out my previous video on mastering aperture, and that will take you through exactly how aperture affects your exposure. Now, brighter conditions like a sunny day will allow for faster shutter speeds, and in low light situations, you may need to use a slower shutter speed. But remember, you've got to keep your camera steady or use a tripod when you're using slow shutter speeds. Otherwise, you are going to get a lot of motion blur in your images. Now, if you want to create effects like you've seen, maybe light trails of cars, driving down the road or a freeway, or maybe you've seen that smooth, creamy, silky, flowing water off a waterfall, then you need to experiment with some really slow shutter speeds, like 1 second or maybe even longer, and always use a tripod for stability. And if you have one, use a remote shutter release as well. That'll help to make sure that you eliminate the camera shake that can happen at those slower shutter speeds. Now, just as a general rule, you may have heard of this rule before, but when photographing anything handheld, a general rule is to use a shutter speed that is the reciprocal of your lens's focal length, or the focal length that you have set. So for example, if you're shooting at 50 millimeters, your lenses, some of them are just a fixed focal length, might just be a 50 millimeter lens, or you might have a lens that goes from 50 to 200 millimeters. You need to just have a quick look and see what you're at. And let's say you're shooting at 50 millimeters, you want to use at least 1/50th of a second to capture that shot handheld. If you're shooting at, say, 200 millimeters, then you want to shoot at 1/200th of a second. And that is the general rule. So the reciprocal of the focal length that you're shooting at will usually give you a sharp shot. Now, with vibration reduction, which is VR, on Nikon lenses, I think it is, and OIS, which is optical image stabilization, or whatever, every brand calls it something different just to confuse us all. But there's a lot of that around these days, that technology. You can get away with actually using slower speeds than that reciprocal rule, but the rule's a good rule of thumb to use. Okay, so just look at your focal length and just set your shutter speed at a very minimum at least the focal length, and you'll get a nice sharp image typically. Alrighty, so that's it for this tip in this video. I hope you're finding these tips really helpful as you continue to learn your photography and get more creative. I want to encourage you down below in the comments. You can reach out in the comments if you have any questions, or if you need any more help with shutter speed or anything really to do with photography, and I'll do my best to answer you as quickly as I can. Now, all that's left for you to do is to get out there and take some photos. See ya.